Harry Truman did as much for civil rights as any other president has, and Lyndon Johnson himself gave Harry Truman credit for what Johnson was able to accomplish in the 60s.
Our Dr. Brian Calfano will take a look into former President Harry Truman and the influence he had on civil rights at that time. That's coming up right after this break. Don't go anywhere.
You're watching Ozarks Fox News. Real, new, now.
Welcome back. It's President's Day, which means it's a fitting time to focus on the legacy of our nation's 33rd president and the only one to hail from Missouri. Of course, I'm referring to Harry Truman, and as you know, it's also Black History Month. But what you might not be aware of is just how influential President Truman was in advancing civil rights at a time when many in his party, and indeed many in the nation, resisted such change. Last week, I had a chance to tour the renovations to the Truman Library and Museum up in Independence and to catch up with director Kurt Graham for his thoughts on Truman's civil rights legacy.
Harry Truman is one of the least likely champions of civil rights that you can ever imagine. He comes from a Southern family, comes from a mother who wouldn't even stay in the Lincoln bedroom when she visited him in the White House because she didn't want to have anything to do with that Northerner. But Harry Truman did as much for civil rights as any other president has, and Lyndon Johnson himself gave Harry Truman credit for what Johnson was able to accomplish in the 60s, saying so much of this began with Harry back in the 1940s. Harry Truman was the first to address the NAACP, and he stood before that group and he said, "We intend to extend rights to all our fellow citizens, to all Americans, and when I say all Americans, I mean all Americans." And everybody knew exactly what he meant.
Our greatest political leaders make policy part of their public speech. Truman's 1949 inaugural enabled the president to remind Americans about their nation's ideals.
The American people stand firm in the faith which has inspired this nation from the beginning. We believe that all men have a right to equal justice under law and equal opportunity to share in the common good.
But if Truman's background didn't flag him as a civil rights champion, what made his commitment so strong?
There is something inside of Harry Truman that caused him to be just an innate, natural champion of the underdog.
And to Graham, Truman's stance on civil rights sprang from the president's core sense of right and wrong.
If someone was mistreated, whether they were Jews in Europe or whether they were African Americans in the United States or anybody else around the world, if someone had been mistreated, Harry Truman felt that was a wrong he had to try to right. And that's how he lived. That's what he did. That was just part of his moral core.
Which isn't to say that Harry Truman wasn't a political animal. But Graham draws a clear distinction between the man from Independence and today's political leaders.
Well, I mean, he was a politician. He was aware of the votes and whatnot. But he recognized Israel in May. He desegregated the troops and the federal workforce in July and had to run for office that fall. Now, this was when elections lasted 2.5 months and not 2.5 years like they do now. But a lot of people have said, well, he was pandering for Jewish votes and for black votes. And those were certainly important constituencies to him. But I'd like to remind anyone who considers that in 1948, he had a much better chance of alienating people than he did drawing people to him with those kinds of stances. Truman came down, he always did not just the right thing, but for the right reasons. I mean, he was true to a core set of principles. And that's what's missing today in our leaders, in the sense that people on the right and the left admire Harry Truman. I have yet to meet anyone who doesn't have some level of basic respect for how Harry Truman conducted himself in office.
The Truman Library is all polished up and ready to open just as soon as conditions with the COVID pandemic permit. Graham hopes for a late spring, early summer grand opening. And we'll be back after this.